Hi, folks. As the meeting room fills up a little bit, you'll see that there is a poll on your screen. This is essentially a digital form of a community sign-in sheet. So as we're waiting for the meeting to start at 7, if you wouldn't mind answering some of those questions, just so we could have a record of who is here. Thank you. All right, we're going to give it just a couple more minutes, seeing that it's 7. And again, the intake form in front of you is just as a record of who is here. However, if you want to be added to the mailing list, if you're not already on there, you can check that box. All right. So I think I can leave the poll up as I begin talking a little bit, because I do want to keep us on track. I do want to make sure we end this evening at 8, and I don't want to take advantage of anyone's time, of course. Councilman, are there any members of your staff in the attendees that need to be moved over? Oh, yep, gotcha.
Yeah, okay, great. You guys see approved. Thank you, Maggie.
Got him. All right, so before we jump into the meeting, just a couple things to go over. I know we are meeting virtually instead of in person. So while we hope to be able to communicate the same level of information and be able to answer everyone's questions, things are going to look a little bit different. The first item is that this meeting is being recorded. Our goal is to have this up on the city's YouTube account for viewing by the beginning of next week. So anyone who was not able to attend this meeting, or anyone who wants to go back and review any information from this meeting will be able to do so. The first is we have this community intake form where we're essentially just having attendees sign in. Once we start the presentation, this form is going to go away. But if anyone joins later or was not able to navigate this form, at the end of the meeting, there's going to be another form that pops up in your browser asking for the same information. If you already submitted your information here, you do not have to fill out that browser form. That one is just for anyone who joins halfway through the meeting or was not able to navigate this form here. And of course, if you prefer to not sign in, no one is stopping you from not completing it. The third is you will see at the bottom of your screen, there is a Q&A button. It has 2 little conversation bubbles. We will have an extensive Q&A session at the end of this meeting. So throughout the meeting, as I'm doing the short presentation, if you have any questions, you can use that Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to ask questions. There are, as always, no questions that are too small, no questions that are too big, no questions that are too silly. My goal here is for everyone to leave having the most information physically possible. So feel free, as any questions come in to your head, to use that Q&A function. All right. So with that said, I am going to go ahead and end that intake poll, and we can begin our intro. So, my name is Maggie O'Neill. I am the Principal Historic Preservation Specialist for Jersey City. Michael, if you don't mind moving to the next slide. And I'm very happy that you all could join us this evening for a discussion on the proposed Sherman Place Historic District. Joining me from City Planning is Michael Akimoff. He is the Senior Historic Preservation Specialist. And we also have your Ward D Councilman, Jake Efros, on the call with us as well. Jake?
Hey, everybody. Thank you first here. Thank you so much, Maggie and Michael, for arranging this. To the folks in the community, so we have it's like a couple dozen here, which is really great. Yeah, really appreciate you coming out and making time to, hear the presentation on the historic district proposal, and also to make, your questions heard and your voice heard. So I'm excited to be talking about this. I know it's been a long time coming, so we're really excited to move the ball forward, and appreciate historic and planning in general for making it happen.
Great, thank you. Okay, so Michael, if we could go to the next slide. So we had our last community meeting in November of 2025, so a couple of months ago. And what we're going to start this meeting with is talking about the things that have changed since November of 2025. And we've had one real major change to the proposal. And then I have some information that was requested by the community at the last community meeting to present with you all. We'll go through each of these individually, but broadly, the first is that the proposed district boundaries have changed a little bit. I will go through the maps to show you guys where those changes are, but overall, the historic district has actually gotten a little bit smaller. The second change is, as a result of those boundary changes, we have had to make some revisions to our nomination report to remove some of those buildings that have been removed from the district. But we've also added in some language that talks about lot size and how important that is to the community. And the last item that has changed since the last community meeting and new information we have to share is we have some examples of applications and timelines and what that looks like, so everyone can understand what the major impact of being in a historic district is, which tends to be the permitting process. So we'll begin by looking over those new proposed district boundaries. So as of November 2025, what is shown in orange were the proposed district boundaries. So you can see it is generally bounded by Kennedy on the west and Central on the east, with Manhattan on the south. It does go all the way up to Hutton in the north, but that really only runs along the spine of Summit. Terms of historic districts in Jersey City, it's a pretty small one. But these boundaries have changed. So Michael, if we could go to the next slide. Now, I promise I have another map to show you all the difference, but what is blue is now the proposed boundaries. It doesn't look all of that different until you overlay them, which is the next slide. Yeah. So you can see, after reviewing the application with the State Historic Preservation Office and reviewing it internally based on their comments, and also going through the district report, we have chosen to remove some buildings from the historic district. Some of these were recommended by the state because of continuity. So there would be, for example, on the southeastern side of the district, right, that corner of Manhattan and Central, some of those buildings certainly have historic integrity, but the state office recommendation was that there weren't enough of them in a row. So we chose to remove that section to keep the overall strength of the historic district sound. It was a similar story over on the buildings that are proposed to be removed from the district on Kennedy. So you can see there was quite a large chunk removed south of Sherman Place, and a little bit north of Sherman Place on Kennedy as well. And we again, these are recommendations that were given to us by the State Historic Preservation Office after they looked at the proposed historic district. Some of those buildings they felt did not have enough integrity to be in the architectural integrity to be in the historic district. So we followed their recommendation and removed them from the boundaries. Overall, this has really only a positive impact on the proposed district. In past community meetings, I've talked about how important it is to have a strong historic district in terms of contributing versus non-contributing buildings. And what this does is this removes a lot of those non-contributing buildings out of the boundaries. Anything that was close to the edge, we did choose to take out. This also means that any property owners or attendees present who own one of those buildings, your building is no longer in the proposed historic district. So we think this is overall a good change. We think it's a lot more manageable, and hopefully will appease some people who were not necessarily supportive of the district. Like I said earlier too, this also resulted in some changes to that designation report to remove the properties from that report that are shown here. Okay, Michael, if we want to go to the next slide. So the next couple of things I'm going to talk about were requested at the last community meeting, which is to talk about the more in depth about the application process and some examples of applications, what those look like, and timelines for review and things like that. Before we do that, I do want to just quickly talk about the types of approvals that I'm talking about. There are two types of approvals in a historic district. There is a certificate of appropriateness and a certificate of no effect. A certificate of no effect is a staff level review. That is 90% of our applications. That is almost everything that comes through the door is reviewed at the staff level. And then there's a certificate of appropriateness, which is 10% of the applications, and those are for larger projects. So additions, new construction, things that need variances, that's going to be the certificate of appropriateness. Again, most of the applications we see are certificates of no effect, and therefore most of the examples that I have for you all this evening are also certificates of no effect. So let's start with a couple of relatively straightforward examples. So these are two examples of interior work. Now I have pictures of the certificates here because these have to be posted during construction. That's how everyone who's around, all of your neighbors know that in addition to having construction permits, you also have historic approval because you're supposed to post this with your approval. But the application on the left was for interior work with HVAC. They submitted their application on May 13th of this year. They paid a $20 application fee. We reviewed the work and we approved everything as was submitted 7 days later on the 20th. So that total application review time was 7 days, and there were no changes to the application as a result of being in a historic district. The application on the right was also for interior work. There was no HVAC associated with this. This was just strict interior work. This was actually work that was a result of a pipe burst. So they submitted their application on April 13th. We requested more information from the applicant. In this case, they submitted a scope of work, but they did not submit the architectural plans that were referenced in the scope of work. They submitted those architectural plans on May 11th, and they paid a $20 fee for interior work, and their application was approved 8 days later. So these are two examples of just a basic interior work review. These are in and out of our office relatively quickly. Very rarely does interior work require any changes from what was submitted. We are mostly reviewing this just to make sure that there's not an effect on the historic resources or the outside of the building and things like that. We want to move to the next slide. Okay. So this is a slide talking about window replacement, which is always a hot button topic in historic districts. The application example on the left was for a rear window replacement. So this is on the back of the building. No one can see it. The standards for historic districts for non-primary facades, right? So the facades that don't face the street are just that it has to match the plane and the finish of a historic window. So that's pretty open for interpretation. In this case, the work was approved as was submitted. This applicant preferred to go with a fiberglass window. We have no problem with that. It's on the back of the building. It conforms with our guidelines. They paid their $50 application fee for exterior work. They submitted their application on May 12th and received their approval on June 4th. So a slightly longer review than interior work, but still much faster than the 45 days that is required by law. On the right, we have a front facade window replacement. So this is on the front of the building where the historic district guidelines require you to match what was there historically. In this case, the applicant was proposing to install wood windows. They paid their $50 application fee for exterior work, and they submitted their application February 2nd and received their approval on February 26th. If you want to go to the next slide. For that wood window replacement, when we talk about window replacement, sometimes people say, "Oh, well, what do you need to see for a window replacement?" Right? It's very clear when something has architectural plans, right, that we need to see them. But for a window replacement, this is an example of a complete application, right? So this is all the materials submitted for the application that I just spoke about. In this case, on the far left, they submitted a scope of work from their contractor that just wrote out how they were going to approach the project. This was a very extensive scope of work for window replacement. Usually we get 2 to 3 bullet points from the contractor, and usually it's already in the contract that you have signed with whoever is performing the work. On the right-hand side are some specifications for the proposed window. If you look closely at all of these, you will see all of them are branded with Marvin. There's no requirement to use a specific kind of window in a historic district. I point out the branding to say that all of this comes from the manufacturer. All of the items that we ask to be submitted are not things that you have to hire someone to produce for you for windows or similar. They typically come via the representative who you are purchasing the windows from. So in this case, we have a description of the windows that is proposed in the center, and then on the right side, we have some specification drawings or shop drawings. Okay, Michael, if you go to the next slide. Okay, so here are some examples where we're getting into some more substantial work. These are both examples for things happening on facades of buildings. The example on the left is for a siding replacement. In this case, they had a $250 application fee. This was a 5-unit condo building. So that $50 fee is per unit affected. So in this case, it was $250. They submitted their application on July 14th, 2025. And then the HPC staff had to work with this applicant to change the material to be a more appropriate material. Originally, they had submitted an application to just stucco the wall that they were replacing the material on. There was never stucco on this building historically. So we recommended that they move back to visually what was there historically. In this case, it was a lap siding, but because it was on a non-primary facade, we recommended that they use a hardy plank instead of a wood lap siding, a little bit more reasonable, especially in terms of maintenance on a non-primary facade. There's obviously a gap between their completed application and when they submitted, but that was because they had to go through the approval process of getting all of the condo owners to approve the change in material. But anyway, they got their application completed on February 2nd, and then they had their approval to do their work on February 11th. So even though there's a longer span of time between when they submitted the application, when they completed the application, once staff had all of the information that they needed to be able to approve it, their approval was issued relatively quickly. The application on the right was for a front facade restoration. And their application fee was $150. Again, $50 per unit, 3 units in the building. They submitted their application on April 4th. They submitted a complete application. We had all the information we needed, and they received their approval 3 days later. So if anything, I think these applications might be a better example of what happens when you submit a completed application for review. But they're 2 examples of different types of facade work. And then here are 2 examples of certificates of appropriateness. So all of those previous examples were work that was approved at the staff level. These are examples of projects that required full board approval. So they were much more extensive, much larger projects. The project on the left-hand side was a certificate of appropriateness for a rear addition that was visible from the street. It was visible through a empty lot behind the building, as well as obliquely as you walk down the street, you could see the addition on the side of the building. They had a $500 application fee, which is the base fee for a certificate of appropriateness. Again, this is a fee that's only on larger projects. They submitted their application on February 18th of 2025. And the reviewing staff member on this worked with the applicant to make sure that they had all of the information that the board would need to review, right? You're not trying to convince the staff person in this case, you're trying to convince the board. Our role in these is making sure that the board has enough information to be able to review it quickly. In this case, we were able to schedule them for a board hearing in May, and the board was able to approve the application at the same meeting. The project on the right was a certificate of appropriateness for the reconstruction of a building and the construction of a rear addition that was visible from the public right-of-way. The building had suffered some pretty extensive damage, so they needed to rebuild large portions of the facade and of the sides in addition to putting that rear addition on. They also had a $500 application fee for a certificate of appropriateness. They submitted their application on March 19th of 2025. I wrote the wrong date there. And in this case, we worked with them to actually change some elements of their project so that it would be more in conformance with the historic district guidelines, and therefore more likely to be approved by our board. Their board hearing date was scheduled for June 17th of 2025, so about 3 months between when they submitted the application and when they were heard. And the board issued their approval the same date, on June 17th of 2025. Again, I apologize for that typo there. So that's just a quick recap of the proposed historic district boundaries and the boundary change, and then some application examples within historic districts. I see that there are already some questions. I'm sure as folks sit with us a little bit more, there will be more. As we give you all a chance to write in any questions, I am just going to very quickly go over some of the items that we have discussed in previous community meetings for folks who have not been able to attend these in the past. At this point, if you have been to a community meeting regarding this will be old news, and I apologize for being repetitive, but I do just want to make sure that every person who is able to attend understands some basics with historic districts. So for those of you who have attended in the past, you can use this time to put any questions you have in the Q&A section. And for those who have not attended this, this is just basic information on historic districts. Okay, so when I say basic, I mean basic, right? So what is a historic district? The best way to think about historic districts is that it is a zoning ordinance change with heavily enforced design standards that are based on the existing buildings that are there. Obviously, this design change, this zoning ordinance change is based on the fact that these are all historic buildings that have been identified, in this case, in Sherman Place's case, to have architectural integrity and planning integrity, right? We've mentioned that a lot of the buildings on Sherman Place have these really long, elongated lots. That's also very important to the historic district as well. What a historic district in this case does is we would add a layer of zoning over top the existing zoning. So 2 layers of zoning. One of them will govern the size of buildings and the uses of buildings and things like that. And that's your existing zoning. That's not changing. We would add then another layer of zoning on top, which would begin to regulate some of what the exterior of buildings looks like. And that would all be with the intention of keeping things appropriate and keeping these historic buildings in shape, and that way they can contribute to the beauty of the neighborhood. There are state historic districts, national historic districts, but in this case, we're talking about a local historic district. The local historic district is the one that will enforce all of these design changes and things like that. State and national register districts serve different purposes. In this case, we're talking about a local historic district. Here is a map of some of the historic districts and landmarks that are within Jersey City. You can see that most of them are concentrated downtown. We do have West Bergen out on the west side. So this would be the first historic district in the Heights. In addition to the 5 historic districts that we also have 13 landmarks. Those are a little bit better scattered throughout the city, but we only also have one of those in the Heights, Holland Street. So this would be a big win for preservation within the Heights, and a large recognition for a lot of the architectural integrity that exists throughout the Heights, not just in this neighborhood. Okay. So when we establish a historic district, there's a whole bunch of work that goes into that. I've talked a little bit about a nomination report, but that has been prepared. So the nomination report has a survey of all of the buildings that are proposed in the historic district. It also has a statement of significance, which talks about why these buildings are important, why they're architecturally important, why they're important historically, and how it fits into the context of Jersey City and New Jersey, and even nationally. There's also a narrative description within this report, which I will be very honest with you is a dry, boring read that basically is like this street intersects this street, and it talks about where it is located if you didn't have a map. There's also photos of each property and the maps of the district. And within this report, it talks about which buildings are contributing to the historic district, so which ones have architectural quality and fit into that scope of being historically significant, and then, of course, which buildings don't fit into that scope. When establishing a historic district, you want to have, of course, almost all of the buildings being contributing to the historic district. You don't want to have too many buildings that are not contributing, because that's brings down the level of historic resources. You generally aim to have at least 85% of the buildings within a historic district be contributing to the district, and we are past that number within Sherman Place. Once we have that report, the next item is to hold a series of community meetings to inform the public of the proposal and gauge support for it. This is where we are right now. We've had a number of these community meetings, and we, at this point, are committed to making sure that everyone who lives in the neighborhood, everyone who lives in the Heights, frankly, anyone who's interested, has as much information as possible to be able to gauge if they would support this proposal. If we get to the point where there is enough support for this proposal, we will staff will submit an application to the Historic Commission to be reviewed by them. If the Historic Commission agrees that there's enough integrity here, we will recommend to the Planning Board that the Planning Board review the application for Historic District. If the Planning Board makes the same recommendation, they will recommend to the City Council that the City Council adopt an ordinance to amend the zoning to include a new historic district for this area. City Council holds a first and second reading of that ordinance, and of course, hopefully it would be approved at the City Council level. From there, the historic district goes into effect. And then we had this slide earlier, but I do think it's worth noting again, because the biggest change day to day with a historic district is just when you do work on your house, that review process changes, right? You have a new level of review process with some standards and design guidelines that weren't necessarily there before. It is also important to note that this only comes into effect when you propose work on your house. Being in a historic district does not mean that Michael and I are walking down the street and putting a letter in your mailbox and saying, welcome to your new historic district. You now need to change all of this stuff. We do not have the power to do that. We are only reviewing work that is proposed on buildings. We cannot compel you to do any work. So again, there's 2 levels of the review that we do. There's the staff level review, which is 90% of the applications that we see day to day. And then there's the board review, which again, 10%, those more substantial applications. You can see the numbers down at the bottom. In 2024, we had a little over 450 total applications. 395 of them were staff level approvals, and 43 were certificates of appropriateness. So those are those larger projects. And then about 20 were withdrawn. application withdrawals happen all the time. Mostly it's just that someone decides they want to do work and then something happens that prevents them from doing that work, so they choose to withdraw the application. Okay, and then here's a quick flow chart. Just again, the application and permitting review process is the largest change that property owners see day to day here. So we spend a lot of time talking about what that looks like, because we don't want there to be any confusion about what happens once you're a historic district. So starting at the top in the blue box, let's say you want to update your kitchen, and you need to change your faucet location, so you need a permit for that. You would file an application with historic, and if we have everything that we need to review the application and it conforms with the historic district guidelines, we will give you a certificate of no effect and you'll be on your way to go get your permits. If you file that application and you fail to submit a scope of work with your contractor, right? You submit the description of work and you submit photos of the property, but we don't have a copy of the proposal or the estimate or anything like that from your contractor, we are going to say that the application is incomplete and ask you to submit that. But let's say that you do submit a complete application and this time you're doing a different project, like an addition, and it requires a COA. We would make sure your application is ready for the board. Again, I gave those a couple examples. Usually it's about a 3-month process once the application is complete to get you to the board. And when you're at the board, if you have 5 affirmative votes, you get your approval and you move on to permitting. If your project is deficient in some way and does not get 5 votes, that would be a denial of a certificate. You can appeal it to the Board of Adjustment or change your project and come back. Generally, we know when applications are going to be denied. We don't like when applications are denied. We work very, very hard as staff to make sure that everyone's time is spent appropriately, and we don't typically put applications that we think are going to be denied to our board unless it's the choice of the applicant. Okay, so that's my quick historic district overview. We have a bunch of questions here. I am going to read the question out loud, and then I'll answer it live. I won't type out answers at this point. Charlene asked if the SHPO recommendations are in writing and will they be available to the public? They are in writing, and Charlene, I can, if they're not on the designation data portal link, I can email them to you, or I can put them on both. I will do both. Okay. Cynthia asked, what about a condo building with multiple units which currently have vinyl windows and someone wants to replace windows? So if those vinyl windows are on a non-primary facade, right? So those vinyl windows are on the side or they're on the back. The property owner has a lot of choices in a replacement window. We do, of course, discourage a vinyl window. They're just not well-made windows. But if that's what the property owner wants to put in, we have certainly approved vinyl windows on rear and non-primary facades before. If they are on the front of the building, they will need to follow the design guidelines, which say that they have to match the original historic windows that were there, right? There's no, within our guidelines at the staff level, we can't approve a like for like change, right? So just because there's vinyl there now does not mean that you can put vinyl there in the future. You would have to go back to a window that would have been there historically. Again, this is the window thing in historic districts tends to be a little bit of a rub, but that's only on the front facade. Those side facades and rear facades, there's a lot more window choices. For an anonymous question, for existing non-historic, non-conforming windows, are property owners allowed to replace to match existing cases of damage or maintenance needs? In cases of damage, so let's say there's a very bad storm where a tree branch comes through your window and breaks it. You can do what you need to do to secure your building. We are not going to give you a violation for having your building unsecured. I'm sorry, for putting in a temporary window to secure your building. Maintenance needs, that's a window replacement, right? You're going to have to follow the guidelines for a primary facade window. So you would have to match the historic window in that case. On a non-primary facade, so again, sides and rear, you have a lot more window options, right? The example I showed earlier in the presentation was a fiberglass window. Sometimes people do aluminum windows, sometimes people do clad windows, sometimes people put vinyl windows in. On a non-primary facade, so again, those sides and back, that is going to be okay. That is going to be something that is approvable at the staff level. On a front facade, it does need to match what was there historically. Okay. Is 110 Manhattan Ave within the bounds of the proposed historic district? So a negative of the map that I showed was that I did not have building numbers. But Michael, as I go through the rest of the questions, can you confirm if 110 Manhattan is within the boundaries?
Yes, I will do that.
Great. All right. So Martin, we'll get back to your question. Okay, Carol. What exactly are the next steps to completion? Are there any tax advantages to being in a historic district? So the next steps, we are still in the community outreach process. Depending on, at the end of this meeting, I will have a poll, an anonymous poll, where we can gauge some level of support. If we feel that we are at the level of support that the majority of people are in favor of this, we would then move this. The next step is the HPC hearing. And then, of course, we'll go to planning board and city council. But we are not in a position where if the historic district is not supported by the vast majority of residents, that we're going to put it through to historic and planning and city council just to be denied. So we want to make sure that residents are informed and residents are supportive before we add this level of zoning to their neighborhood. Are there any tax advantages to being in a historic district? I cannot think of any tax deductions for property taxes or anything like that to being in a historic district. There's also no additional tax burden, right? There's no special tax allocation or put on your property for being within a historic district. For certain income producing properties within historic districts, certain projects might be eligible for federal historic preservation tax credits. We don't typically see a lot of that within Jersey City, but for income producing properties within a national register district, which this has the possibility of becoming, there are tax credits available for that. Okay, Scott, is this historic district more or less inevitable at this point? What is the process for going through with this or not? So I've discussed a couple process questions. If they're not clear, please put a couple more questions at the bottom and we can continue to go through that. But as I previously said, I wouldn't necessarily say a historic district is inevitable. Our goal here is to make sure that residents understand what is being proposed, and we hope that most people are supportive, right? As staff, we've spent a bunch of time on this because this is a really strong collection of buildings that have a lot of architectural integrity. However, Councilman, I do see your hand raised. If you want to unmute yourself, you feel free to jump in.
No, please feel free to continue answering the question. I have a later question.
Okay, cool. It's something that we are as staff is supportive. We know that the local neighborhood association is supportive, but our goal here this evening is to gauge the level of support for this and to provide as much information as possible for us residents. We don't need to necessarily jump to something being inevitable or not. Our goal right now is information gathering. Okay, Councilman?
Thank you. Can folks hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. Yeah, thank you for the presentation. I don't want to skip the queue too much with the other questions we have. I'm just wondering if there's a publicly available list of the addresses in the updated district. I think that could be helpful in, both tonight, or if it's not available tonight, in the coming days, to just communicate with folks in the area and make sure everyone knows who is and who is not covered.
Yeah, we can in a follow-up email tomorrow, we will send the revised maps with the revised addresses to folks. Cool.
Thank you.
And just to jump back to that question real quick, 110 Manhattan is within the district.
Thank you.
No problem.
Okay. Martin, we will list that as answered. Cynthia asked, will new construction of ADUs be permitted, and also partial demolition of contributing buildings to construct the ADU be permitted? So earlier when I spoke about how there is the historic district like this would be structured as you have your base zoning, and then there'd be an over zoning of historic. ADUs are something that are covered in base zoning, right? So in this case, the buildings in this historic district are, for the most part, zoned as RH1 and RH2. These are zones that encourage larger lots. They encourage restoring buildings. They have a lot of this historic related features without it being designated as a historic district already. These two zones permit ADUs. Adding a historic overlay on top of the base zoning will still mean that ADUs are permitted, right? It will not mean that no more ADUs can be permitted. In fact, in this historic district, there are a ton of historically occurring ADUs, right? In this historic district, there are a ton of historic carriage houses that have apartments within them that have been there for centuries at this point, or at least a century. So that will not go away as a result of this historic district. What will happen, though, is those ADUs will have a level of design review that does not currently exist. So with the base zoning right now, that the ADUs that are permitted are going off of what they can put there based on the bulk standards, right? So how big can you build it? How tall can you build it? There are not standards for what does that ADU look like? How does that ADU impact, the setting and the historic nature of the historic district? That's what the historic zoning will do in this case. It will add a level of design review to these, and also add a level of demolition review that did not previously exist for other applications. Councilman, feel free to jump in.
No, thank you for that clarification. And just because I know for folks on Sherman Place especially, but throughout the Heights right now, the ADU conversation is a really hot topic. In addition to making sure that we got this meeting for the Historic District overlay, I also just wanted to note that I'm working with planning on potentially getting language around an amendment to our ADU ordinance. So we've been having those meetings around the ADUs, and I know this is a issue close to home for everybody here, for many here. So just we're moving forward on some language discussion around an amendment. Just want to get that out there, and I'm happy to continue to have a conversation with folks on this call and beyond about that. And apologize, I keep going on and off camera, eating a little dinner while we do this meeting before my next meeting.
All good. Okay, continuing on with the questions. Richard asked, does Jersey City compensate homeowners for the increased time and costs associated with renovation in a historic district? The city does not have a compensation structure set up for this, so the answer to that would be no. Charlene asked, can the historic districts restrict or limit ADUs to existing accessory buildings? Again, the underlying zoning here does permit ADUs, so adding a historic district on top of here will not mean that no ADUs are permitted. There will just be a stronger design review process for them. Cynthia asked, why are there so many ifs about districting? This is a community-based initiative as opposed to a top-down decree. I agree with you, Cynthia. It is a community-based initiative. However, the purpose here is to make sure we reach all members of the community as best as is possible and get feedback from everyone. I don't want anyone to think that their opinions or their perspective on something that's happening to a property that they own is any less important than anyone else, which is why, again, my goal here this evening is information gathering on staff's end to gauge levels of support, and also providing as much information on this proposal to the public so that you guys can make an informed decision on what you as residents want for your neighborhood. Okay, there is an anonymous comment to keep this to Sherman Place and to please leave Sanford and Manhattan out of this. That is noted for the record. Charlene asked, are all historic districts in Jersey City overlays? If not, why? So no, not all historic districts in Jersey City are overlays. The 4 downtown historic districts, so Paulus Hook, Van Voorst Park, Harsimus Cove, and Hamilton Park, are zoned. They have a specific zone that is Zone H for historic. The West Bergen East Lincoln Park Historic District on the west side has an overlay zone on top of their existing zoning. This is primarily done because the downtown historic districts all have very, very similar building typology, right? So in almost all the downtown historic districts, they may look a little bit different on the outside, but the vast majority of buildings are connected row houses that are all, for the most part, of similar heights. In West Bergen and in Sherman Place, you have a lot of different building variety types, right? You have some connected wood row houses, you have standalone large Victorian houses, you have these large pre-World War II apartment buildings with many condo units inside, and having one set of zoning to govern all of those different building types would create a lot of unnecessary variances. So that's why we chose to do in this case a overlay zone, or an overlay zone is proposed, I should say, and that mimics what's done in West Bergen. It's honestly a little bit more effective in terms of zoning and building types than having one district that guides many, many, many different kinds of buildings. Okay, Carol said, I thought historic district designation only applies to the exterior and what can be seen from the street. Your presentation goes into internal changes. Please explain. So the heart of this is correct. We are primarily reviewing from the street and what you can see from the street. When we review interior work, we are reviewing that work to confirm that it does not affect what you can see from the street. So when we look at not window replacements, those you can see from the street, those are on the outside. When we look at things like kitchens and bathrooms, we're not looking to see what fixtures you chose, the location of your work triangle in your kitchen. We are looking to see where your ventilation goes to make sure that we're not putting a vent on, the front facade of the building. That is also why those reviews are much shorter, because that's the type of thing that we're looking for, not necessarily reviewing what happens on the inside of a building. Okay. Apologize, I'm having a little bit of a scrolling issue. Okay. With regards to HVAC options, do split AC units require approval? They do require approval, but we approve them all the time. Those are a very standard approval for us as long as we have the information that we need at the time of review. Those are issued relatively quickly. When I say all the information we need at the time of review, for mini splits, we do need to know where that condenser is going and how it will be attached to the building if it is attached. Once we have that, it is a very straightforward approval. Okay. Scott, are there different standards for approval for non-contributing buildings? So there's no specific different standards for non-contributing buildings in a historic district. What we do, though, is the purpose of us reviewing a non-contributing building in a historic district is to make sure the changes that are proposed are not going to have an adverse effect on the actual historic buildings in the historic district. There are a couple examples of this throughout the historic districts in Jersey City, but a primary example of this would be front facade changes. So on a non-contributing building in a historic district, we're not necessarily going to say, oh, you need to put a historic material on your building. That would be silly. Your building isn't historic. It's not contributing to the district. What we might say, though, is the black brick that you have chosen really detracts from the surrounding historic buildings. Can you pick a different color brick? And then we generally find some kind of middle ground there. If you have a non-contributing building with non-historic, right? This is, again, a building that is not contributing to the historic district. It's not historic. There are quite a few new construction buildings on Sherman Place, right? So this would apply to them. Those buildings and those property owners do not need to put wood windows on the front of their building. There were never wood windows there. They're not historic buildings. You don't need to follow the historic window fenestration that might have been there. So that's how those standards are applied to non-contributing buildings. Okay, Charlene said, please speak to the benefits of a historic district in a hot real estate market. Well, I am certainly not a real estate expert in any way, shape, or form. However, I'm happy to talk about some of the benefits of a historic district just broadly, in perhaps terms that are important to a lot of Jersey City residents right now. My pitch for historic districts generally is that you all moved to this area for a reason. I would hope that one of the reasons is that you liked the way that it looked. You liked the buildings, you liked the trees, you liked the wider streets, you liked being able to walk down the street, see your neighbors because everyone's in their front yard because everyone has a little front areaway, things like that. Being in a historic district protects those things. It gives you an additional say in development when someone is proposing something, right? It's not necessarily just you missed one planning board meeting and suddenly something is going up. There's an additional say for larger projects. And you can take solace in the fact that any major changes to anything in the historic district, for the most part, is going to reflect what is already there. It's going to reflect why you chose to live where you live. Right? There's, of course, as I've explained, there's a couple of extra hoops that you have to jump through for this to happen. But for the most part, those are minimal changes that happen pretty rarely for property owners. Most people are not making radical changes to their house every single year. This is something that most people encounter once every couple of years. For the most part, you can probably forget that you live in a historic district, except for the fact that it looks a specific way. Carol said, I thought this historic district was on the master plan already. It sounds like this is not the case. Please advise. This historic district is listed within the historic preservation element of the master plan. So that is, and it has been since at least 2023. So that is certainly done. That is certainly in effect. It is listed in the historic resource inventory and recognized as having architectural significance in the master plan. Okay, 4Orange has said, what is the timeline for designating? So again, provided that we feel like we have a good level of support for this based on the community meetings that we've been having, we would then move it to the Historic Commission for review, where they would then recommend to the City Council, Planning Board, and then City Council. That process would take probably, just from the HPC hearing to City Council, would probably take about 4 months. 1 month for HPC, 1 month for Planning Board, and then 6-8 weeks for City Council, depending on when it makes it on and the first and second readings of those ordinances. So it's about, like I said, it's about 4 months and 4 more public hearings, right? So 4 more opportunities to voice your support or your apprehension to this proposal in a public forum. Would an ADU be permitted on a flat roof? So an ADU is an accessory dwelling structure. So it's actually a separate building on the lot with specific standards for how big it could be. So ADUs are permitted to have flat roofs themselves. But if you have a flat roof, what you would put onto it would be called an addition, not an accessory dwelling unit. The accessory dwelling unit is separate from the primary building on the lot. If you have a building that has a flat roof and you would like to put an addition on there, as long as you're meeting the standards in the guidelines for additions, then that would absolutely be permitted. Can the underlying zoning be changed? I'm sorry, this is a question from Charlene. Can the underlying zoning be changed to reflect the existing built historic resource and add ADU restrictions? So the underlying zoning for the vast majority of this historic district is RH1 and RH2. Those zones were put into effect as part of city planning's movement to do some corrective zoning in parts of the city. So in this case, those are relatively new zones that we wrote with places like this in mind. So that zone was written and implemented to reflect the existing historic resources. It's actually been pretty successful to the extent that we have put it in other places in the city as well. And in terms of adding ADU restrictions, that's a conversation, again, because it's about the base zoning, that's a larger city planning conversation, but it sounds like Councilman Efros is on it and is working with city planning to address some of the concerns about ADUs. Okay. Matt said, does the historic district have any impact on properties which have paved every square inch of their property for parking? The short answer is yes. The long answer is that has more to do, again, with that underlying zoning. As I said earlier, Michael and I, and also Dan, who works in our office, we can't force applicants to change things on their property until they are proposing it. But if someone who has a significant portion of their property paved were to come in and say, I need to redo the paving or make any changes to that part of their property, they would then have to follow the existing zoning guidelines, right? So at that moment in time, when they come in and say, hey, we want to make changes, they have to follow the current zoning, which would require them to likely remove some of that paving for parking. Okay. Colin asked, at the HPC meeting on Monday, there seemed to be a question of conflict between the underlying zoning regulations and the historic overlay, specifically over open space and height. How might a similar conflict come up in the Sherman Place Historic District? So this is, again, in reference to an application that was heard on Monday at the HPC, where there was a question regarding a subdivision. This is a little bit different because the RH1 zone, which is those larger lots, right? So the lots on Sherman Place, that are 50 feet wide, 75 feet wide, that zone discourages subdivision. So we don't anticipate those height and open space issues being as much of an issue here, because the vast majority of the underlying zoning here recommends that those larger lots stay intact, right? We have those larger lots that are so specific to Sherman Place and are so important, and the underlying zoning helps keep that intact. Okay. I'm sorry, I'm having a scrolling issue with the questions that I can't quite seem to fix. Every time I scroll down, it scrolls back up. Okay. All right. Cheney said, not all property owners live at the property. Some are real estate investors. Thanks for speaking of the positive points. Can briefly touch on any negative. Sure. There are certainly a lot of perceived negatives about living in a historic district. I would say, though, the one that impacts, I've spent a lot of time this evening talking about the one that impacts the most people the most often, the one that we see as the biggest pain point for people who come into our office, which is just that there's an extra step in permitting. The other pain point that it's not specific to historic districts per se, but the other pain point we see a lot of is if something is owned by someone who does not occupy the same space, they might not be aware of some of the requirements of living in a historic district and that level of review, and they might make some inappropriate changes that are, of course, not only frustrating to look at, but also can be frustrating as property owners when you, quote unquote, do everything right and follow the regulations and you see someone down the street putting something up. That is something that we are working on as a city, zoning enforcement, making sure that everyone understands the requirements of the zone that they're in. But it can be particularly painful in historic districts when you put so much time and effort into maintaining your property and you see someone down the street who might not take that same level of care. Okay, and we have a question from an anonymous attendee. If you are in the historic district, would you be allowed to replace windows with eco-friendly option that may not be wood, like fiberglass or metal? For sure. You can do fiberglass or metal on those side facades and rear facades. Again, that non-primary facade, there are so many options for window replacement. It's that front facade that can be a little bit more difficult for people to kind of grasp, that it does need to go back to the historic window material. However, in the past couple of years, we've seen a lot of strides in terms of window manufacturing, and there are a significant more window options that are meeting some of those LEED standards and some more eco-friendly, so they're called standards, that are also made out of wood. Okay. I believe that I've gone through all of the questions that were asked. I really appreciate everyone taking time to attend the meeting and also ask these questions. Again, my goal, hold on, one more came in and we're not at 8 o'clock yet, so. But I will finish what I said. Oh, thank you, Matt. I appreciate it. So again, our goal this evening was to make sure that all of you had the opportunity to ask questions and to help make as informed of a decision and your level of support as is possible. I am going to put up a poll. If you feel comfortable at this time, it is an anonymous poll. We cannot see who answers what. If you would feel comfortable responding to let us know your level of support for this so that we can look at what our timeline looks like going forward, we would really appreciate that. Councilman, I know you're still on. I don't know if you have any closing remarks.
Thank you. Yeah, just again, I really appreciate everybody's questions. And I am committed to helping this move forward and answering more questions from folks as we go through the next stages with those 4 more opportunities for public hearing. So I'm hopeful that we can see some positive response and that kind of majority support for this. I think this is basically a good thing, and we should be able to move forward. But of course, that is going to be dependent on having community support. So, yeah, I'm here to answer questions, to talk through this, and to keep an open mind as we move through these next stages. But excited to see where it goes. And Michael, Maggie, thank you for making this happen tonight, and thanks to everybody for coming on.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So on the screen, as I've been talking, is my and Michael's contact information. If you have additional questions that we were not able to answer, please feel free to email either one of us, both of us. We are more than happy to answer them via email, set up a time to talk if there are specific questions you have. If there's something you want us to look at, we're happy to come out on Sherman Place as well, walk you through some of the things that we see. I am going to leave the poll up until 8:02. We'll give it another 2 minutes to make sure everyone has had the opportunity to respond to it. But again, I really want to thank you all for joining us this evening. And again, we are here if you have any questions, anything that pops into your head. I will, as I said earlier, send out the updated historic district proposal map, and I will also send out the list of properties that are within the historic district and the couple that have been removed from the proposed historic district, so that everyone can see that as well. And I suppose my last, yes, sorry.
Sorry, I'm about to jump off, but I wanted to see if there's a way that I can post my email address, whether it's in the Q&A or whether it's because we don't have an actual like a
Yeah, no,
chat.
we don't have a chat box.
Okay.
Would you like me, when I send the email tomorrow, is it okay if I CC you?
Please do. Yep.
Okay,
Thank
so
you.
yeah, I'll put the councilman's email and his staff's email in the email body himself, but they'll also be CC'd if you have questions for them specifically.
Thank you so much. Good night, everybody.
All right.
Thank you.
And my last closing note is that, again, if you did not get a chance at the beginning of the meeting to fill out the intake form, just so we have a record of who is here this evening, it will populate in your browser as we close the meeting window. If you have filled out that form, you can go ahead and close right out of that. And if you joined us late and did not fill out that form in the beginning and feel comfortable filling out that form now, we would really appreciate it. Thank you all so much for your time this evening, and have a great rest of your night.
Have a good night, everyone.